And I would caution against just taking a spot in your yard that's grass right now, putting down some weed fabric or landscape fabric. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an awesome day. It is Monday, January 15th here in South Georgia, and we're almost a year and a half in with our raised bed plot behind me. We've been getting a lot of questions lately about these beds and our setup here, so I wanted to use this video as an opportunity to answer some of those questions, talk about what we've liked about this system so far, and whether we change anything if we had to do it all over again. So although we still love our in-ground garden plots for some things, just a year and a half in, myself and the entire family has really been enjoying having these raised beds out here. They work great for smaller plantings when I don't necessarily need a 30-foot row of something like this mustard here or like those collards and lettuce over there. They're also really easy to flip or turn over, so when one vegetable is done, in just a matter of minutes I can have any particular bed ready to plant something else, which makes it really easy for us to keep things growing in these beds year round. Now, one thing I wasn't sure about when we put all these together was whether or not the color on these would fade over time as they're getting beat down by the sun every day. But a year and a half in, color looks the same to me as the day we installed them, so I'm really liking that as well. Now let's get into some common questions we get about these beds and our setup. Some of these questions will apply specifically to these ollie garden beds. Some will just apply to setting up a raised bed plot in general. So the first question we get a lot has to do with using support bars inside these beds to keep them from bulging. Now, when we installed all these beds, we didn't use any support bars inside them, and I don't know if you can tell by looking at that angle, but ours really haven't bulged at all. We haven't had any issues with the beds expanding out, even though we didn't use the support bars. Now, in talking with the head honcho at Ollie Gardens where we got these beds, he told me that the support bars are really only necessary if you're combining multiple beds together to make, for example, a really long rectangular bed. So they're not really necessary for these single bed kits, but if you were doing your own custom design, you know, connecting a bunch of them together, you might need the support bars. And the second question we get sometimes is whether or not this paint will leach into your garden soil. So the inside of these beds are white, the outside, they've got several different colors you can pick from. The metal, I believe, is something called alu zinc. It's like an aluminum zinc alloy that's rust resistant, and then they're powder coated to whatever color you choose. So it has been my experience so far that the outer coating on these beds doesn't really scratch or chip. I've hit the side of these beds with garden tools a bunch of times, ran into them with a wheelbarrow when I wasn't paying attention, and it didn't really take any paint off. So I can't say with 100% certainty that anything's coming off those beds into the soil, but it appears the paint or the coating stays where it's at. Another question we get a lot has to do with the taller beds versus the shorter beds. I think the shorter beds are 17 inches tall. The taller beds are 32 inches tall. So a lot of people want to know if we had to do it all over again. Would we do all tall beds? Are the tall beds worth the money? I think they're about twice as much as these shorter beds are. Now, I really like those tall beds. They come out to about my waist, and whether you're cultivating the soil, prepping it for planting, or doing some harvesting, there's really no bending involved when you're working on those taller beds. So if you're getting on up there in age or you're limited physically and it's in the budget, I would highly recommend going with the taller beds. Now, obviously, that's going to take more resources to fill than the smaller beds. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but if bending is an issue for you, the taller beds are the way to go. Now, with our particular setup here, I was going for a staggered or a kind of step down design with the tall beds in the back, stepping down to some of the shorter beds. I had seen pictures of that done. I really like the way it looks, so that's why we designed ours this way. But I think it would still look really good if you had all tall beds out there. And another question we get related to the bed shape or the bed size is this design versus this design here. Now these round beds are just round beds, but these right here are what they call their 12-in-1 bed. So there's 12 different shapes or configurations that you could set up with this kit right here. You can do the wider rectangular bed, or you can do these narrow beds. You don't use quite all the pieces with this bed. You do use all the pieces with this particular configuration. And for me, this goes back to design aesthetics more than it does practicality. Yes, ideally, if you purchase one of these beds, you'd like to use all the pieces, get the most square foot of garden from each bed that you could. But with this particular plot here, I wanted to make sure I had the same amount of space between each row of beds. That was just enough space to push a wheelbarrow down there. I didn't have enough space in this row for another row of those wider beds. I did have room for this row of the beds on the narrower setup, and I also kind of like the looks of having the different shapes out here. The next question, which is probably the one we get most often, has to do with our irrigation setup here. People want to know, would you do anything differently if you had to redesign your irrigation for these beds? Now, if you didn't see the videos when we set all this up, I'll do a quick recap here. So we have 5/8 mainline tubing running under the ground along each of these rows of raised beds. So before we put these raised beds where they are, we made a little 4-inch trench and laid that mainline tubing down in each trench for each row, and then it's all connected together here on the end. It sticks up a little bit right there because that's where I hook up my water hose. And then before filling each bed with soil, we put a T down there into that main line, created a little riser that came up to the top of the bed, installed this valve here, and we've got a nice little setup where we can use drip tubing or drip tape, whatever we need in each of these beds. And so to answer the question, no, I really wouldn't do anything different as far as my irrigation system here goes. I know a lot of people were questioning burying the mainline tubing underneath the beds and not going with something a little more durable like PVC, but I haven't had any issues thus far and don't expect to have any issues going forward with that stuff being buried. I would highly recommend putting a valve on each bed like we did. If you're going with a multiple bed setup, that makes things really easy, just turning that valve off when you're not needing to water any particular bed. I also like having the little irrigation risers come up inside the bed as opposed to outside the bed. Just looks a little cleaner that way. That does mean we give up a little bit of space inside the bed there where our valve sits and where we hook in to our main line, but it's not that much space, and I'm willing to make that sacrifice just for the looks of it because it looks a lot cleaner that way. And then the next question we get for these beds, or pretty much any raised beds in general, is what do you fill them with? Do you need to put good soil in the entire bed, or can you just put a little bit of good soil on the top? Now, when we installed all these, we filled them mostly with some old, I think they were 13 or 15-year-old composted wood chips we found at a local sawmill. We were able to get a big load of that stuff for pretty cheap. I had used it in some other garden spots, knew it had a pretty good nutrient content to it, and so that's why I used what we used. A lot of people recommend filling the bottom with logs and stuff, or just some other kind of space filler, because you don't need to fill it all with good soil. However, one thing I have learned since gardening in these raised beds is that roots on our vegetable plants go a lot deeper than you think they do. We don't ever see it in the in-ground garden where we're pulling stuff up because we break off a lot of those roots when we pull up plants. But digging around in these beds here, flipping beds from one vegetable to the next, I'll see root activity way down in there. So given that, I would say this: if you've got shorter beds like these 17-inch tall beds, I would recommend filling them all the way with some good soil, because your plant roots are going to get that deep a lot of times, and you're going to need good nutrition in the entire bed. For those taller beds over there, probably not necessary to fill those completely with really good soil, probably only about halfway or so. So you could use logs or just some sorry dirt in the bottom of it, but you know, about halfway up, start putting some good soil in there, something that's going to feed your plants well. And the next question we get, which is definitely something to consider if you live in the South, is whether or not these beds get too hot. Now, even in the heat of summer, I have never noticed these being too hot to touch. Not like a, cow trough or something like that that can really get scorching hot in the summer. So for whatever reason, the outside of these beds stay relatively cool, don't get too hot to touch. I was worried a little bit about the height of the beds. These beds, these taller ones here, being that much closer to the sun compared to our in-ground garden, would it maybe scorch some of our plants? And I think we disproved that one pretty well with our tater grow out last year. So we had taters planted in the in-ground garden and taters planted in those tall raised beds right there. We had really good performance from our raised bed taters. We know taters don't like our late spring heat, but the ones in those raised beds held on just fine and gave us some really good production. So I wouldn't say that the elevated height really is going to make plants suffer more in the heat. At least for us it didn't. And then the last question I wanted to answer doesn't have to do with the beds themselves, but more the space between the beds. A lot of people ask about putting down landscape fabric or plastic mulch between the beds and whether or not that is necessary. Now, we didn't use any weed fabric because before these raised beds sat here, this was an established in-ground garden plot where we had grown a lot of cover crops, we've done a lot of tarping, done a lot of things to work on our weed seed bank over the years. So we knew our weed pressure wasn't that high in this area here, and we could keep most of them suppressed with just that red wood chip mulch. We do get a few weeds every now and then, but it's not overwhelming. And I would caution against just taking a spot in your yard that's grass right now, putting down some weed fabric or landscape fabric and put some raised beds on top of it. I have seen grass grow through that stuff pretty quick. So if I was setting up a plot like this, what I would do is treat it just like I was setting up a new in-ground garden plot. I would till up the plot, and I would till it every week or two for a couple months till I really got those grass rhizomes broken up, really got my weed seed bank low. Then I would install my beds and put down some kind of mulch between the beds and leave out the landscape fabric. Because even if you've got that weed fabric down there and that grass starts growing through it, it's going to grow into your beds and cause you all kind of problems. And once you get grass grown over the top of that weed fabric, you've just got a mess on your hands. So think a lot before you just go throwing raised beds anywhere. Think a lot about the area you're putting them and prepping that area so you're not fighting weeds all the time. And then the last thing I would add, which is not a question but more of a tip, is to plan for expansion. So maybe you eventually want to have a multi-bed set up like this right here, but you're not going to do it all in 1 year. This is where you need to sit down with a pen and a piece of paper and do a little bit of dreaming. So dreaming out in your head what the perfect setup would look like, draw it out, and then just add to it year after year until it's finally complete. That's going to keep everything nice and symmetrical, keep you from just kind of shoving a bed here and there. Planning it out ahead of time is going to make it look really nice in the long run as you add a bed or two every year. And planning ahead like that is also going to make your irrigation so much easier. So when you draw out that dream plan, go ahead and draw out your irrigation as well. That way, as you add more beds, you can just kind of hook into your existing irrigation system and eventually have it all work together, turn on the water, and it feeds all the beds. So even though I used to be hardcore solely an in-ground gardener, I have really enjoyed having these raised beds here. And I think even if you have a large in-ground garden, everybody could benefit from just a few raised beds because they work so well for smaller plantings where you don't need an entire row. So I hope you enjoyed the video today. We do have these styles of beds available on our website at lazydogfarm.com. Ollie Gardens has a bunch more different styles on their website. If you decide to buy from them, you can use the code LazyDogFarm to get 10% off. And if you want to learn more about our irrigation setup here and see how it was installed, watch this video right here. We'll break it down for you. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.